The first time I realized the world I trusted was a lie. I was standing in the kitchen holding an envelope that smelled like someone else's future. My hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the sudden weight of a truth that would reshape everything I thought I knew about home, about love, about who I was. My name is Emma. I grew up believing in the safety of family dinners, the quiet rituals that made life predictable. Holidays, birthdays, small apologies, and the gentle hum of ordinary days. My parents weren't perfect, but I believed they loved me in the kind of way that holds you even when the weather is bad. That belief was the kind that kept me whole. But what I didn't know that day was that love could be a currency, and my life could be used as change. I'll tell you the whole story, the slow, sharp unraveling of trust, the moments that made me question what I had been taught, the choices I made when the ground disappeared beneath my feet. It's a story of betrayal, of quiet, simmering anger, and of a kind of revenge that didn't scream. It's simply exposed and reclaimed. It's the story of how I took back my voice, and my future, and how those who betrayed me were left speechless. My world before the storm, I was the kind of daughter who took pride in being reliable. I cooked, I called, I kept receipts, and I congratulated my parents on retirement plans that, to me, seemed like the final reward for decades of steady work. We lived in a modest house with a garden my mother tended to like. It was her cathedral. My father, with his quick smile and easy laugh, had a way of making everything feel like an inside joke. They were the center of my childhood universe. After college, I moved back for a while to regroup, to save money, to be there through a rough patch. My job was steady, but not glamorous. I worked at a small nonprofit, and I loved it. My parents called me practical. They said I had good instincts. I trusted them when they gave me advice about which investments were safe, and when they said, a little conservatism would keep us comfortable, I listened. After all, who was I to argue with the people who had guided me through my first heartbreak, who had helped me tie my shoes? There were small hints, oddly enough, that not everything was as it seemed. Little inconsistencies in our bank statements. A picture of my father wearing a watch I didn't recognize. A name mentioned in passing that never showed up at family gatherings. I dismissed them. People keep secrets. Families guard little mysteries. But I wish I had listened to that small animal inside me that knew when a puzzle piece didn't fit. The glimpse of betrayal, it began with a letter. Not a text, not an email. A paper envelope slipped under my bedroom door, the sort that belonged to the life of official things. It was addressed to me, but the return address was from a law firm I had never heard of. I opened it with more curiosity than dread. Inside was a notice, an update to my mother's will. It included my name and, in italics that felt deliberate, the words discretion advised. I remember standing there, the floor cold beneath my feet, reading and rereading lines that should not have surprised me. My name was in the will, yes, but it wasn't the amount that stopped my breath. It was the details, properties sold, accounts moved, and instructions that seemed to favor interests I had never seen in our life. I confronted my mother gently at first. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, a misunderstanding, a misplaced document, something that would restore normalcy. Her eyes flicked away. It's for legal reasons, she said. Your father and I decided together. That answer felt like glass under my palm. Smooth, brittle, and ready to cut. After that envelope, the world started revealing itself in small, almost mischievous ways. I found receipts tucked into drawers that didn't belong to our household. Bank transfer notifications on my father's email that mentioned names I had never heard before. And a lease agreement for a property in another city with my parents. Listed as partners with someone I knew only by reputation, a man who dealt in quick profits and quicker smiles. Every discovery felt like a small pinprick to my sense of reality. I asked questions, and the answers were always just so. We're helping a friend, it's an investment. You don't understand the way business works. But the tone of those answers changed over time. Where there had once been softness, there was now evasiveness. Where there had once been complete honesty, there was a curtain of convenient words. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at night, lamp on, piles of documents spread around me, feeling like an archaeologist of my own life, brushing dust off memories to see what lay beneath. The more I brushed, the more fragile everything felt. The real hurt didn't come from the financial maneuvers or the secrecy. It came from a single sentence my mother said, while I pressed her for clarity. "We did what was best for us, Emma. You were always independent. You'll manage." She said it with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was not the kind of reassurance I had trusted in childhood. It was a sentence that pushed me out of the story I had expected to live. In an instant, I felt like an unpaid chapter in someone else's book. I thought about every sacrifice I had made. Late nights helping with taxes, years of emotional labor, smoothing rough days, the calls I never missed. Ton of it mattered in that sentence. I realized, with the cold clarity of a winter morning, that they had been viewing me as a line item. And when you are an item, your worth is determined on paper, not in heart. Grief arrived first, not as the heavy sorrow I had imagined, but as an empty, echoing hole where comfort used to be. I felt betrayed, yes, but there was also this small, persistent disbelief. How do you rewrite your memories when the people who made them are the ones who changed the story? Anger followed grief, but it was angry in a quiet way. I didn't explode. I froze. I cataloged. I observed. I learned to read between sentences, to hear what was unsaid. I also learned to watch my parents' faces when money was mentioned. They had become skilled actors, but I had always been good at faces. For weeks, I did nothing. People asked if I had been in shock. Maybe the moment that pushed me from hurt into action was small and ordinary. A call from my father's bank. A routine. Notification about an automatic transfer had been mistakenly sent to my email, and the subject line read, "Transfer to our Holloway urgent." That name stopped me like a physical blow. At the same time, a client at work confided in me about a company scandal, a hidden property funnel that funneled retirement funds into offshore accounts. The pieces began to fit like a sinister jigsaw puzzle. My parents' involvement was not a mistake. They were being used, and they were using. I remember the exact feeling. An internal shift, like a door opening. It's not rage in the cinematic sense, but a clearer seeing. There is a difference between knowing and seeing. I had known there were secrets. Now I saw the skeleton of a plan. My parents were either complicit in something that hurt people, or they were protecting someone who was. When I confronted them the next time, I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I asked direct questions, and I watched the answers crumble. My father's face went pale. My mother's jaw clenched. That's when my father slipped, and the story changed, not because he wanted to tell the truth, but because he was not prepared to keep lying. I had been. There is something about betrayal that makes you withdraw into a cave of contemplation. I took long walks at night, replaying moments, looking for footprints that led to this betrayal. Sometimes I thought of leaving, but I couldn't decide where to go. Where do you flee when the very foundation of your life is a lie?
It would be easy to paint the following months as a dramatic showdown, but the truth was more insidious. Betrayal operates in the small saboteurs of daily life. Missed calls, cash withdrawals, whispered conversations. I became an investigator of home. I started to document everything: bank statements, emails, photographs. I kept a journal of conversations and dates, the kind of dry, meticulous record that later became the backbone of everything I would do. My work life provided me an unexpected advantage. It taught me to listen for patterns, to follow trails, to understand networks of people who profit from misdirection. I used those skills to trace the money, to follow it from our accounts to accounts that bore unfamiliar names, to properties that had been acquired in the name of shell companies, to an office with a nameplate belonging to R. Holloway. I tried to believe there might still be a human explanation. Maybe my parents had been naive, manipulated by a smooth-talking intermediary. Maybe they had been protecting someone they thought was family. But the more I dug, the more the evidence suggested deliberate intent, purposeful decisions to prioritize money and connections over honesty and welfare. There were nights when I sat in that kitchen and let the silence speak. The house was the same, but the warmth had turned thin. I think the worst part was imagining my parents arranging conversations as if they were actors in a play, passing lines until the scene fit. The intimacy of family had been replaced by strategy. The cost of knowing is a strange burden. It severs you from the naive hope you once carried. I felt both liberated and aloneness. Some people suggested I forgive quickly. Others advised that I leave and never look back. Neither felt right. I struggled with small, immediate things. The Sunday dinners that had once felt like an anchor now felt like a field of mines. How do you look someone in the eye when you have evidence they intentionally misled you? How do you explain to friends and colleagues that your parents, your people, might have been complicit in something harmful? My circle shrank. It wasn't that people didn't want to listen, but the story felt unbelievable. There is shame mixed with betrayal, a private mortification that others can't always grasp. I felt judged by my own family's choices. How? Had I missed the signs? Did their betrayal reflect on me? These were questions I wrestled with at 3 in the morning when the house was the loudest. From pain to planning, at some point, deep in the quiet, a thought took root. If I could gather proof, if I could document beyond doubt what had happened, I might be able not only to hold them accountable but also to protect others who could be hurt by the same scheme. That thought transformed anger into action. I started small. I made copies of documents and secured them in a safety deposit box under an assumed name. I set up an anonymous email and began reaching out to people who might have been affected. I consulted a lawyer who specialized in white-collar crimes, someone who could translate my instinct into legal language. The lawyer listened without shock and said 2 words that felt like a scalpel: "We can investigate." There was fear, too. Not of jail or punishment, but of destroying the last remnants of my parents' dignity. How do you expose someone you once defended? But what I had learned was that dignity cannot be used as a shield for harm. If someone's choices were endangering others, silence would make me complicit. The months that followed required an almost monastic patience. You cannot coerce truth. You must assemble it, one fact at a time. I worked with my lawyer to subpoena records, to track property transfers, to build a narrative that could not be dismissed as family squabbling. We were careful not out of spite, but out of necessity. The evidence had to be undeniable. During this time, I practiced a kind of emotional triage. I allowed myself small moments of normalcy: coffee with friends, a walk in the park, a book read without skimming for clues. But the work was always there, a quiet hum beneath daily life. Sometimes I thought revenge was a sharp sword. Mostly, it was a slow, patient unmasking. What surprised me most was how isolated truth could be. I reached out to distant relatives, hoping someone could corroborate what I had found. Some turned away, frightened of the consequences. Others simply refused to believe family could be capable of betrayal. But there were a few unexpected allies: distant cousins, an old neighbor, a former business partner who had his own story of being taken advantage of. Their testimonies added color and weight to the black and white documents. Love versus justice. Those months brought complicated moral questions. I loved my parents in a way that did not disappear because of their choices. But love had to be redefined. Love does not mean protecting someone from the consequences of their harmful actions. It does not mean allowing a pattern of deceit to continue because you are afraid of pain. I remember standing in my mother's garden on a rain-wet afternoon, watching her tend the roses, and feeling both tenderness and fury. It would have been so easy to storm in and pour my accusation like a flood. But I had learned that shame and fury, while cathartic, rarely produce lasting change. I had to be smarter than that. Our small legal case became larger than our family. Investigators followed the trail of shell companies and found a network of exploitative deals. The man, R. Holloway, was not just a name. He was a pattern: someone who preyed on trust and used family ties as camouflage. The evidence we had amassed helped others who had been victimized. People who had been silenced began to speak, carefully, at first, then with growing confidence. When authorities came knocking, the house felt different. There were no dramatic confrontations with shouts and slammed doors. In truth, the real drama had been the months of quiet accumulation of proof. The climax was administrative. Asset freezes, subpoenas, recorded statements. My parents were questioned. They were not monsters in the way some stories frame villains. They were individuals who had made choices, and those choices had consequences. The morning the first public announcement was made, we sat together in the living room like survivors of a storm. The world outside was the same, but our inside had altered. My parents' faces were drawn. They looked smaller somehow, stripped of the illusions they had wrapped themselves in. I felt the old instinct to soften, to protect. But I also felt a kind of steadiness, the quiet knowledge that I had done what I could to seek truth. I did not celebrate their disgrace. It was not triumph in the way some revenge stories show. Instead, there was a solemn recognition. Justice had been served in a way that would prevent future harm. The men who had used my family as a front were exposed. The accounts were frozen. The houses were investigated. And my parents, though implicated, were not the architects of everything. The investigation revealed a complex web of manipulation, greed, and, yes, human frailty. The aftermath was messy, not cinematic. There were apologies that sounded small in the face of months of deception. There were tears and a question that hung heavy in the air. How do you rebuild trust when the foundation has been cracked? My revenge was not about breaking them. It was about exposing what had been hidden so that healing could begin somewhere honest. I wanted the truth to be a light, harsh, perhaps, but clarifying. The best kind of revenge I could imagine was to turn humiliation into accountability and to transform secrecy into transparency. One surprising thing happened. Some of the community began to see my parents as victims as much as perpetrators. People reached out with their own stories of being deceived by the same man. Stories spidered out: neighbors with weird leases, a retired teacher who had been convinced to invest in a property that never materialized, a cousin who had quietly lost savings. Our small family crisis unfolded into a community reckoning. That was the moment I understood the larger purpose of what I had done. It wasn't merely to punish, it was to prevent others from being taken. Legal consequences followed. Some assets were recovered and redistributed, settlements arranged, and some people faced charges. My parents were required to cooperate with investigators and, in turn, were offered counseling and legal guidance. There were no dramatic prison sentences or vindictive takedowns. This was not a revenge fantasy. It was a sobering legal aftermath that brought accountability in a way that felt measured. Our family had to learn new rhythms. Reconciliation was not an overnight miracle. It took months, then years of small acts, honest conversations, therapy sessions, financial transparency, and the rebuilding of trust. They made mistakes that hurt people, and they tried to make amends. Some of the hurt could not be undone. Other parts were repaired slowly, with steady work. I learned to forgive in stages. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means recognizing that people are flawed and can change, and sometimes with help, they do. I also learned to set boundaries, practical, healthy limits that protect me and keep the past from repeating itself. If you had asked me in the months before the investigation what I wanted, I would have said, I want them to admit it. But what I really wanted, deep down, was to be seen. Not the daughter who tidied the house and hid the awkwardness, but the woman who had a right to truth. In reclaiming the narrative, I reclaimed myself. If we must call it that, was not vicious. It was craftsmanship. It was letting evidence speak instead of hysteria. It was building a story so robust that it could not be ignored. In doing so, I protected not only my future but the futures of strangers who might have been manipulated next. There were costs: emotional fatigue, strained relationships, the ongoing work of rebuilding. But there were also gains: clarity, justice, and a renewed sense of self. I discovered that I could stand on my own feet, not as a result of cutting ties, but because I chose to hold people accountable and to demand honesty, the moral that lingers. If there is one lesson I want to leave you with, it is this: truth matters more than appearances. It is easy to let comfort outweigh fairness, to believe that preserving an image is kinder than facing consequences. But secrets, especially those kept for the sake of profit or protection of selfish interests, erode the things we say we care about. Another lesson: Revenge does not have to be destruction. Sometimes the most effective response is clarity, patience, and the courage to let daylight in. When lies are revealed through careful, responsible action, the result is not simply humiliation, it is protection. It is the difference between dramatic vengeance and sustainable justice. And finally, love is complicated. Loving someone does not obligate you to shield them from responsibility. You can love and still insist on integrity. If you are in a situation where secrets are being kept at your expense, ask for proof, document what you can, and seek counsel. Speak to people you trust. You are not weak for demanding truth. A year later, I walked back into my mother's garden. The roses bloomed like they always had, in color and proud defiance. There was a peace now, not naive, but honest. My mother and I had rebuilt parts of what had been broken, and there were days when the old laughter returned, quieter but truer. I won't pretend everything is fixed. Some relationships never fully recover, and some wounds remain tender. But the house is full of fewer secrets and more straightforward conversations. When money comes up now, we speak plainly and openly. When a decision is to be made, all voices are heard. In the end, my revenge left them speechless, not because I wanted to shout triumph on a rooftop, but because the truth was undeniable in public. They could not continue the silent bargains that had allowed manipulation to flourish. They had to face the consequences, and in facing them, they finally had the opportunity to change. We live in a world that sometimes rewards secrecy and punishes honesty. But when secrets harm others, silence is complicity. Justice does not always look like spectacle. Often, it looks like patience, documentation, and courage. It looks like sitting in a lawyer's office to make sense of a messy truth, and it looks like walking through the fallout with your head held steady. If you find yourself betrayed by those you love, remember, you do not owe your silence to anyone. Seek truth, gather proof, protect the vulnerable, and never confuse the appearance of love with its substance. Love that harms is not love. Love that hides is not care. There is healing after betrayal, though it is slow. There is power in exposing the truth, not for revenge's sake, but for protection's. And there is a particular kind of peace that comes from choosing accountability over cover-ups, transparency over secrecy. If my story teaches anything, let it be this. You can reclaim your life not by breaking the people who hurt you, but by unmasking the harm and creating a safer space for everyone who might come after. The revenge I sought wasn't to destroy, it was to reveal, to correct, and to protect. And in the end, that left the ones who had betrayed me speechless, not because they were punished theatrically, but because the truth, finally, had been heard. Short epilogue: some days, when the house is quiet, my father will sit by the window and trace the rim of his coffee cup, looking out at the garden. Sometimes, without words, we both acknowledge how fragile things had become and how unlikely it was that honesty could return. But it did slowly, imperfectly, because we chose to confront what had been hidden. The roses still bloom, and so do we, scarred, wiser, and honest. If you are watching this and you are living through a similar betrayal, know that you are not alone. It is possible to stand up, to gather your truth, and to change the course of what seemed like a predetermined ending. It will be hard. It will be lonely sometimes, but it will also be worth it. Thank you for listening to my story. May it give you courage to seek your own truth and strength to ask for the justice you deserve.